Development is ultimately a policy challenge, and the more you restrict the possible policy options countries have, the more difficult that challenge becomes. We need more multilateralism, less liberalization, more development. The big story about all the things that we've been talking about and the shifting nature of global governance and international institutions hinges on where China goes over the next decade.
Hello and welcome everyone to the second episode of our podcast series on the lessons from the new international economic order. My name is Anamaria Copilau and I am your moderator together with Werner Raza.
Hello everybody, my name is Werner Raza. I'm the director of the Austrian Foundation for Development Research and one of the coordinators of the newly initiated Vienna Global Forum. The forum is a new initiative, as I said, that seeks to develop alternative visions and proposals for global cooperation. For more information, please visit our website, viennaglobalforum.org. The motivation for this podcast series precisely has to do with our conviction that history can teach us something important about our present predicament. More specifically, the debate on the new international economic order of the 1960s and 70s offers lessons for those of us who look for possibilities to reconstruct alternative forms of international cooperation in times of resurgent global power struggles, if not imperialism. In our previous episode, we, together with our guests Vijay Brashert and Paul Stubbs, we sought to contextualize the new international economic order, or NIEO, understand its claims, successes and failures, as well as draw some lessons from it for our current predicament. In this second episode, we will take a closer look at the global trade system and how the countries of the Global South wanted to reform it. So let's jump into the debate straight away. Back to you, Anamaria.
Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our guest for today's session. This is Richard Kozul-Wright, professor at SOAS in London, who has previously worked at the United Nations for over 30 years and was also the director of Globalization and Development Strategies division in UNCTAD. Thank you for being with us today. Now, in our first section, if we take a step back and look at the global trade system, we see how, despite repeated reforms, structural inequality has persisted. And a good example of this is the International Trade Organization, which included development-oriented provisions, but failed when the United States refused to ratify it, and what replaced it was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, which focused more so on trade liberalization as opposed to development. And its core principles of non-discrimination and reciprocity favored industrialized countries to the detriment of developing states. Now, the Global South has challenged the system through various fora or initiatives, such as UNCTAD or the NIEO, and their key demands have been better access to northern markets, more stable commodity prices, as well as just a greater flexibility for development policies. But the reforms were consistently weakened by the opposition of developed states, as well as the 1980s debt crisis and the rise of neoliberalism, and even subsequent efforts, for instance, the Doha round, have produced quite limited results. Nevertheless, trade and globalization has also brought significant benefits to various states throughout history, and especially in the second part of the 20th century. So before we actually jump into how the system should be reformed or what role UNCTAD and the NIEO played, I would like to start with a much more balanced perspective. So how do we reconcile the positive and the negative dimensions of the global trade order?
Yeah, good morning, Anamaria. Good morning, Werner. That reconciliation is probably not necessarily a word I would use to describe the history of governance of international trade over the post-war order. It's always been a very contentious issue. From the beginning, it was meant to be part of the Bretton Woods negotiations, and the US and the UK could not agree on having it as part of the Bretton Woods negotiations, so they hived it off to the United Nations for discussions that, as you rightly pointed out, morphed into the International Trade Organization that was eventually rejected by the U.S. Senate. Look, the difficulty is reconciling difficult domestic policy questions with international responsibilities, and particularly avoiding what was recognized in the 1930s to have contributed to a chaotic and ultimately a very dangerous international environment by countries going it alone, looking exclusively at their own interest and acting accordingly to the detriment of a more stable and prosperous international economy. And that remains the challenge, I think, still to this day, of how do you reconcile those domestic circumstances, policies, and needs with those international responsibilities. And in many respects, the basics of the GATT system were positive and acceptable. I mean, the most favored nation status and national treatment have clear values, and the problem, as you pointed out, was that they largely evolved in a context which clearly benefited the advanced economies, because the very specific circumstances of developing countries, the structural weaknesses and subordinate economic position that they faced and continue to face in the global order, were not adequately addressed. And if you don't adequately take them on board, market forces will essentially work to the advantage of the winners. And in a way, that was the problem with GATT. It wasn't that the principles were somehow nefarious. I don't think they were. But in a system in which you have a very diverse set of countries, in which some are clearly weaker and more subordinate, market forces are unlikely to correct that. And if you don't give countries the opportunity to do things in line with their own needs and circumstances, the chances are that things will not work out positively for that group of countries. And that's that challenge of adapting subordinate and weak circumstances to a more universalist agenda remains at the heart, I think, of the international trading system still to this day.
Richard, thanks a lot for that. Perhaps let's dig a little deeper into the concerns that the newly independent countries of the global South had when they, addressed the issue of how to reconcile the global trade regime with their specific developmental needs. I mean, first of all, wasn't it the case that most of these countries, when they became independent, already were confronted with the GATT as a kind of provisional organization that had laid down the fundamental principles of the global trade regime? So they faced a situation where they had to kind of lobby hard to bring their developmental concerns into the agenda of that system. So that's perhaps one of the problems that they faced, and that, to my understanding, was difficult to achieve given the predominance of the United States and other Western countries in the newly created system. But apart from that, wasn't it also the case that at least when you look at the more liberal literature on the history of the GATT system, that the system itself was basically, it was not very comprehensive in the sense that the WTO later became, but that it was basically just oriented towards tariff reduction. amongst mostly industrialized countries, while many other kind of topics and issues that later became integrated into the WTO system remained outside, which in a way led some scholars like John Ruggie or more recently Danny Roderick to argue that this kind of system of embedded liberalism left a lot of kind of policy space to countries. And it was not that disciplining as the later system, the later WTO system became, when it also kind of regulated intellectual property rights and many other issues. So was this claim that the GATT system was too kind of constraining really valid, or how would you assess that, given when you compare what the GATT system was with the WTO system that emerged in the 1990s?
I think that it's not a question of it wasn't too constraining, because the advanced economies didn't want it to be too constraining. They wanted their own policy space at the end. I mean, they had a very different kind of agenda that had evolved, in the interwar period, which is a much more classical liberal agenda. They wanted the international system to support their newfound concerns with full employment, with the creation of a welfare state. They needed to protect certain sectors like agriculture that had been a very contentious part of the interwar period. So they didn't want to be constrained. And so you got a system with GATT that did allow for a lot of flexibilities. Obviously, the challenge for developing countries was not a full employment, welfare-based economy. It was getting out of commodity dependence into industrialization, getting out of highly informalized labor markets into more formal. These were a different set of challenges that were not accommodated by within the GATT system. As you said, the ITO was more accommodating in terms of addressing those kinds of problems than was the GATT, which was just a subset of the ITO. And people forget, I think, it is very important when looking at that history, because we tend to look at that history very much through the lens of Bretton Woods and the financial and monetary aspects of international governance. And we tend to think, well, that was Keynes's big success. But the original, I mean, the people who designed Bretton Woods, or the original designers, were not really Keynesians. Funnily enough, they were New Dealers. The UK was a declining power. It was the US that was driving the agenda, obviously, in Bretton Woods. And interestingly enough, the New Dealers were much more cognizant of the kind of structural challenges facing economies, and which is why I think, when you look at the ITO, it had all the elements that one would associate with a kind of New Deal agenda rather than a Keynesian agenda. And the tragedy, I think, of the ITO was that, after Roosevelt died, then and private capital began to push back in the United States, you got this kind of environment at the end of the 1940s, which was dominated by a kind of the reconfiguration of American capital that wanted a more liberal world, and the Cold War ideology that became dominant and was a much more exclusionary type of agenda than I think the original New Dealers wanted the global governance agenda to be. So there's a kind of tragedy in the rise and fall of the ITO, which reflects that complicated history in the 1940s, and I think it's important to recognize that, because in some respects, when we get to the new international economic order, it was actually picking up themes that had been introduced into the global governance debate in the first half of the 1940s, which did recognize that there were significant structural differences between advanced and developing and newly independent developing countries. And so that's understanding, I think, that connection is very important to try to position where the NIEO was also coming from.
Yeah. It seems to me that the interesting kind of institutional proposal that came out of these discussions in the 1950s and early 1960s was that many kind of governments in the global south seemed to conclude that it will be very difficult to correct the agenda or to kind of revise the agenda of the GATT system. Although, later they became, most of them, almost all of them became members of the GATT. But they also quite, soon developed this idea of setting up an alternative body, which later became UNCTAD. And that's quite interesting because it seems that there was a clear understanding that in the circumstances that you just mentioned, with the upcoming Cold War and the division between the West and the East, the room for compromise, the room for change kind of narrowed. And in that situation, governments in the global south seem to understand that an alternative institutional structure would be necessary that could be set up within the United Nations kind of environment, given that many of those newly independent countries had become members of the United Nations and thus could at least to some extent influence the agenda of the United Nations. So would you agree that that this was kind of the overall assessment at the time from the governments of the global south? How would you then assess this process that led to the formation and establishment of UNCTAD, which then became a central venue also for the discussions on the NIEO, as far as I understand? And what were kind of the initial reactions also from the countries of the global north? Was there some kind of outright opposition from the start, or how would you assess how this institutional project then developed?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the 50s is a little bit more. There's a bit more going on in the 50s, perhaps, than you suggest, Werner. Obviously, the World Bank was meant, as in its name, it was about reconstruction and development, right? And I think when the reconstruction part was hived off to the Marshall Plan, there was probably an expectation as the bank got going that the development part would become a more significant and much more cognizant of the challenges that developing countries were facing. And it never really happened. I mean, I don't want to belittle the work of the World Bank in the 50s, because obviously they did some important work in infrastructure development and other things. But there was a feeling that it was already apparent that the World Bank, would be dominated by Western or Northern thinking. That was clear already in the 50s. The UN is interesting too. I think obviously the fact that it was a more democratic body, it wasn't accredited nation-dominated body, was important. But the big development fight in the 1950s in the UN was the attempt by developing countries, partly in response to their disappointment with the way the World Bank was evolving, to create a special United Nations Fund for Economic Development, SUNFED, which was incredibly contested negotiations, caught up in Cold War ideology and personal attacks, and not particularly pleasant. And if you look at geopolitics at the time, a lot of developing countries were not really comfortable with the UN as a body. There were serious disappointments, I think, with you saw that, for example, in the whole debate and discussions and interventions in the Congo, for example, being a classic case of the kind of disappointment that developing countries had. So and it's not an accident that the first real manifestation of developing country solidarity was not in the UN. It was at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. They were certainly searching for alternative forums, developing countries, as it became apparent that the the rules of the international game as they began to evolve in the post-war period were not addressing their problems. But it was not clear where, though. I don't think it was necessarily very determined where that would go institutionally. I mean, it ends up in UNCTAD, and when you look at the creation of UNCTAD, it's not an accident that it kind of creates a parallel UN structure, right? We had our own Secretary General in UNCTAD. No one else had a Secretary General.
Mm-hmm.
We had our own General Assembly. We had a Trade and Development Board, which had its own rules that were separate, reported to, but separate from the General Assembly. We had our own administrative structures and recruitment practices. It's not an accident, I think, that the people created a kind of parallel UN in Geneva, because there was that concern that New York and the situation in New York was to some extent stacked against developing countries. And I think that, UNCTAD that creation of UNCTAD was a conscious reflection of those concerns that developing countries had, not only about the Washington institution, but to some extent about New York as well. And not surprisingly, I mean, it was resisted from. The expectation was that there would only be one conference, and that's certainly what the Americans didn't want to see, a kind of permanent institution at all based in Geneva dealing with these issues. There had been fairly feeble attempts to reform the GATT in the late 50s and early 1960s by bringing in some issues that were of more concern to developing countries. And I think advanced economies really would have been happy to kind of make those marginal changes to GATT practices rather than see the creation of an alternative forum where developing countries were likely to have a much stronger voice. So I think from the get-go there was resistance to the creation of UNCTAD. And when you look at the history of UNCTAD, there were certain personalities, ironically, that played a real key role in getting it off the ground. Edward Heath, for example, who became a subsequent Conservative Prime Minister, became who was the UK representative at the first UNCTAD conference, was actually a significant player in kind of forging a degree of consensus in the final outcome that established a more permanent body in the way that we eventually saw UNCTAD emerging.
The reason why I raised this issue is that in the discussion about the important role or central role that the WTO then assumed in the 1990s, in the literature there has been a debate about the merits of forum shifting. The idea behind that was the success of shifting, for example, the whole issue of intellectual property rights from the World Intellectual Property Organization, an institution that already existed for many decades, into the trade domain. So forum shifting was seen as an essential element in making trade and the newly formed WTO the most important kind of institution governing trade in a broad sense. So if you take that argument about the kind of strategic merits of forum shifting, it seems to me that the Global South, by pushing for the establishment of UNCTAD, kind of employed a similar strategy in a way. Yeah, we can discuss whether that was successful at the end of the day, but nevertheless, they said, okay, if we can't really reform the agenda of GATT, let's see whether we can establish an alternative and obviously competing body that can, then kind of mediate our debates, come up with common proposals, and put them on the table at the international level. And I don't know if you agree, but one could make an argument that UNCTAD was successful in that venture to the extent that it influenced then the direction and agendas of the consecutive GATT rounds of tariff negotiations. And when you look particularly at the 1970s and the Tokyo round, one could perhaps make an argument that the so-called enabling clause of 1979 that gave a little bit more room for differential treatment towards the global south was a compromise solution to these demands that were also brought into the GATT discussions, and that clearly originated from UNCTAD, the G77 discussions, and the whole NIEO debate. So I don't know how you see that, because it seems to me that given the later development starting in the 1980s and 1990s, we tend to a little bit overlook the history and also the relative successes, at least, of this agenda of the NIEO and UNCTAD in the 60s and 70s. But it seems to me that one could make this argument that to some extent this was a kind of strategically a successful move in the 1960s to set up UNCTAD, because it then kind of institutionalized, if you want, an alternative point of view, and it led to certain proposals and pressure that at the end of the day, at least by the late 1970s, led to some partial successes. So I just wanted to hear what is your view on this period, and when you kind of assess it from our today's vantage point.
I think that's largely true. I think when you look at the first decade of UNCTAD, the real successes, I mean, there were important moves on the trade front. The real successes were, of course, with respect to finance. So, that's a problem with UNCTAD. People think it's a trade organization, given that that's what's in the title. But it was never just a trade organization. It was, its original mandate covered a number of areas, and it always understood that trade should not be isolated from other elements of the international economy that have a bearing on development prospects in the South, of which finance was always a central concern. Prebisch himself, after all, was a central banker, so he understood the issue of finance in a fairly intimate way. And the early successes were probably were stacked in favor of reforms in the Washington. UNCTAD was responsible for making sure that special drawing rights became available to all members and not just to a subset, as was the original intention of the G10 when it came up with them. Various concessional financing windows came out of work of UNCTAD in the 60s. ODA 0.7% target was an UNCTAD initiative. The creation of the G24 in Washington to represent developing. I don't think you couldn't come up with a similar list of success stories on the trade front. Actually, I mean, there were successes, but I don't think you could come up with a similar, which is why Prebisch was himself very frustrated and left arguably prematurely UNCTAD with a certain disappointment, actually, when he left in 68, 69. So there was still this feeling that I think on the trade issue, they were not getting the kind of traction that they expected. Although the UNCTAD did act as an important forum for airing grievances and pointing to the weaknesses of the GATT system when it came to the needs of developing countries. And the Tokyo round is an interesting round in that respect, I think, because there was an attempt within the GATT Secretariat to push back against what was seen as certain developing country, a kind of the movement away from kind of certain universalism of the GATT that was beginning, as you rightly said, already in the early 60s, and there was a group of very kind of neoliberal, what we would see as neoliberals in the GATT Secretariat that were kind of really kind of disturbed by the way in which development was becoming part of the trading system that they saw in a very stylized way as a kind of as a universe based on a set of universal principles that should not be in any way breached, and they didn't succeed with the Tokyo round. Not, I don't think, because of developing countries, but because the advanced economies themselves were very divided on trade issues in the 1970s. You know, Nixon had unilaterally imposed a 10% tariff once when they went off the gold standard, and then introduced security as being a legitimate reason for derogation from the GATT rules, and so there was a lot of conflict within the advanced economies, and the Tokyo round eventually was a very compromised kind of document, and so, you know, and after that the neoliberal agenda actually again shifted away from trade to finance. In the 1980s, it was very much the financial system that became the focus of pushing a more neoliberal agenda rather than trade, which doesn't really start until the Uruguay round. And so it's a complicated story, I think, about the way in which the system evolves. The NIEO was obviously, the new international economic order was obviously the focal point for a lot of international engagement. In fact, probably it was the dominant theme of reform of the global system coming out of the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. I think, you know, developing countries really grasped the global governance agenda in the 1970s through the NIEO negotiations, and that's why, again, I think looking at the NIEO and thinking about parallels with the current era are actually important for looking back historically to try and think about the lessons of a period when developing countries really did try and drive a systematic reform agenda of global governance.
Yeah. I think it's perhaps a little bit of an irony that, by the time in the late 70s, early 80s, when there was a lot of frustration in Western countries, particularly in the United States with the GATT process, and there was probably something like a crisis of the GATT at the time, that, at precisely this point of time, you had the shift in the economic policy doctrine in the United States and in the UK that led to the establishment of what later we called a neoliberal form of economic governance. That precisely at that time, when there perhaps might have opened a certain window of opportunity for influencing the GATT agenda to a larger degree, the other, particularly financial conditions, worsened to such an extent that the NIEO, the momentum that was sustained throughout the 70s, basically had to be, abandoned, and basically the whole kind of institutional and political momentum broke down. So I think that's retrospectively, at least, a little bit of a paradox that it was not able to push further towards reforming the system in a more progressive way. So my next question would then be, how would you assess what happened then in the 1980s and 90s, not only with the NIEO but also with UNCTAD? How did the change in the kind of political climate, the change in the economic policy orientation impact the work of UNCTAD, given that it came out of this very specific history of pushing for, whatever, a fairer global economic system? Was there some kind of institutional resistance to this new emerging geoeconomic and ideological landscape? Or how would you assess what then happened in the institution, and how the political dynamics played out then in informing the agenda of UNCTAD?
Yeah, obviously, to to a large extent, the NIEO was kind of UNCTAD's big moment on the global stage, right? And we were de facto we were a secretariat for the NIEO. Obviously, the negotiations were largely taking place in New York, but the G77 did not look to the UN Secretariat in New York so much. It looked obviously to UNCTAD in terms of substantive reform support, and and the issues around, and again the issues in the NIEO were not just trade issues. It was a very comprehensive set of reforms to the financial system, to the commodity agenda, to international trade rules, to the management of multinational corporations that were being pushed through the idea of a new international economic order. And so when that, and we can talk about why that failed. I guess that it's an important part of the story about why that agenda, as I said, partly picking up on old themes. I think I do think that the NIEO was picking up on some of the themes abandoned both with the collapse of the ITO, but also the direction the World Bank and the IMF were taking in the 50s and 60s. It was clearly quite a shock to UNCTAD when it collapses. But interestingly, it wasn't the end of UNCTAD's relevance, because again, as I think as I said, the debate in the late 70s, early 80s shifts away from trade issues really to financial issue. I mean, the debt crisis was arguably the reason why divisions began to emerge amongst the developing countries themselves, and the pressure to go to adjust along the lines being promoted by the Washington institutions was incredibly powerful on policy making in the South. But the focus was finance. I mean, the big figure, again, the big figure was not really a trade figure. I think the big figure that people should look at more carefully, of course, is Volcker. Paul Volcker is the key figure, I think, when it comes to reform of the international architecture. He was there at both the beginning of the 1970s, because he was part of the discussions with Nixon on cutting the links between the dollar and gold in the famous discussions at Camp David in 71. And he was there at the end as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, where his agenda, explicitly stated, was the controlled disintegration of the global economy that had evolved in the post-war era. And his focus was on, repositioning the dollar, liberating finance, particularly American finance, the rise of Wall Street, the liberation of large multinational firms as the powerful agents of economic change in the global economy. And UNCTAD's big its moment continued with the debt crisis, obviously. I mean, the debt crisis and how to handle that and what the solutions were. No one really had a solution to it. There were the efforts of Brady and then Baker. UNCTAD positioned itself as offering a much more radical solution by suggesting the need for some sort of sovereign debt workout mechanism that could deal with the problems in a managed and timely and effective way that would not simply trash the economies and keep them in a state of economic recession. And so, we had a continuing moment really in UNCTAD beyond the NIEO, dealing with the consequences of the crisis of the late 70s and early 1980s. And it's not really till the collapse of the Soviet Union probably then that UNCTAD really begins to lose its sense of original identity. I think that's a pivotal moment, really. I think because developing countries it coincides with developing countries accepting the argument that the only way for them to recover and move ahead was to embrace private capital and find a set of reforms that would bring in private capital, because they couldn't really rely on international finance in any systematic or serious way. So that embrace of private capital and the acceptance that the Washington Consensus was the only way in which you could kind of move ahead in a world dominated by flexible exchange rates, private capital flows, and unregulated large multinational corporations. And at that point, I think UNCTAD moves from being what was essentially a reform-based. Our job was to reform the rules of the game in a way that was more friendly to developing countries, to essentially being a critic of the system. I mean, we, in that period from the late 80s through to the early 90s, our role became one of criticizing the way in which, criticizing the winners, if you like, of the breakup of the of the post-war international economic order. And that I think was a fundamental change in the position of UNCTAD within the wider family of global institutions.
One last question perhaps on this history of UNCTAD, because I find it so illuminating, before we then move on to part 3 of our discussion in terms of what can we learn for our current predicament. That brings me back to the role of actors within international institutions. We tend to think of the whole NIEO discussion and the United Nations as basically a discussion that takes place between governments, more or less, because they are kind of international or intergovernmental institutions. And to some extent, that's certainly true, because these governments or the countries they represent are the kind of, if you want, actors of primary importance within those institutional setups. And it seems to me that, for example, UNCTAD certainly profited from more or less explicit support from European countries in the 60s and 70s that were mostly governed at the time by social democratic governments. So there was some kind of mild support, from the Socialist International and people like Willy Brandt and Kreisky and Olof Palme, etc. And that certainly, when that broke away in the 1980s, that certainly weakened the balance of power within the organization. But nevertheless, it seems to me, and that has been, a constant criticism of the United Nations over the last 30 years, that another actor became more important in influencing debates, and that is private transnational corporations, or if you want, the corporate sector. So how would you see, and then perhaps in the 1990s you had global civil society coming in. So I would be interested in your assessment of what has been the relative importance of those new actors in those discussions. And how have they kind of influenced the agenda, and perhaps also influenced not only the agenda directly, but also via, new forms of what then became called multi-stakeholder initiatives, or, this kind of outreach formats. So how would you assess that? Was this decisive at some points in time relative to the role of governments? That'll be my final question on this part 2 of our discussion.
Yeah, it's a long question. It's a very important question, Werner, for sure. And there's no doubt that the influence of civil society, including the private sector, if you include the private sector in that, becomes much more influential within the entire United Nations system, not just in its economic, and not solely in terms of economic areas. And I think, in a way, UNCTAD is an interesting case, because because in the early 1990s, we absorbed the remnants of the Center for Transnational Corporations, which had been a very, which was not a product itself, but which kind of coincides with the new international economic order discussions. It predates it, actually, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was established in 1973. But it's part of that world of worrying about the undue control of large international firms on prospects in developing countries. But by the early 90s, it had essentially become the opposite of what it was set up to be. That is, rather than looking how we can better regulate transnational corporations in support of development, it had become a cheerleader for attracting FDI as a solution to development country problems, essentially. That somehow FDI was the silver bullet that developing countries must look for, and if they're going to deal with their development challenges, and that by then the center had been abolished because essentially very much under American pressure. And it had become a subset of DESA, the wider secretariat in New York. And then in '93, it was moved from UN DESA to UNCTAD. And that split. I mean, and in UNCTAD, obviously, the feeling was that, again, it was always the feeling in UNCTAD, FDI was not something to be shunned in terms of development policy, but it was something that had to be managed carefully in the context of a wider development strategy if you were to benefit from it. And that was not the position of the remnants of people who moved from New York. They believed that FDI was the solution to development country problems. And that became a tension within UNCTAD. I mean, a serious tension between the faction that was supporting a more managed approach to FDI and those who wanted a more liberal approach to FDI in line with what amounted to the neoliberal virus inside UNCTAD, I would call it. I stood on one side of that fence, obviously. And so, I, from my point of view, had an incredibly pernicious view of not only in UNCTAD, but I think in development thinking more generally across the United Nations. Then you got this counterweight of bringing in civil society that tended to have an activist view of the role of TNCs and the role of FDI. And I guess that's where we still are to some extent. It's not some. I don't necessarily adopt that view either of the role of FDI in a development strategy. FDI has an important role to play, but it's there's a tendency to moralize it from an activist kind of point of view, and I don't think that is the right way either. I think it's a policy and ultimately political question. So I actually don't necessarily think that the increased presence of these non-governmental stakeholders has been a positive influence, at least on the development agenda in the UN. But it comes in the context in which the UN's broad work on development has become seriously watered down, much more fragmented, no clear vision in the way that, when it was very much an UNCTAD agenda, it had a clear vision. It was underpinned by a strong analytical framework that comes out of the structuralist tradition. That's all kind of it's almost disappeared, I would say, Werner, from. So there's a lot more voices in that terrain now, in the development pillar, but I think it's a lot less effective as a consequence of that.
Yeah. Well, perhaps I'd like to kind of end this discussion on the role of UNCTAD specifically by nevertheless emphasizing that I think the intellectual work that has been done by UNCTAD also, over the last 30 to 35 years, particularly in the field of foreign direct investment and the whole issue of investment regulation, has nevertheless been important. Also in terms of upholding certain kind of structuralist traditions, but also in terms of providing a very much needed kind of evidence base when it comes to assessing FDI flows and their developmental impact. So from my point of view, the major achievement in a way and success of UNCTAD nevertheless has been that it has remained a certain reference point for the development economics discussion on all these issues, notwithstanding the if you want erosion of coherency and programmatic kind of points of view that happened during that period. So I think UNCTAD for me has always been a reference point when looking for not only data but also some kind of orientation of where, say, things stand in terms of investment regulation. So I think that has been an enduring tradition of the organization, even after arguably it has lost its political clout in influencing international economic discussions. But perhaps let's then move to the final part of our discussion, which is the issue of how the trade system or the international economic system should be rethought under our current circumstances, because that's at the end of the day what we are really interested in when discussing all those debates from the 60s and 70s. What can we learn from these debates for our current predicament in terms of ideas, but perhaps also in terms of more specific proposals? So I hand over again to Anamaria to kick us off into this final section.
Yes, thank you. So recently I've seen that some ideas from the NIEO are re-emerging, whether that involves creating new institutions or just reforming the existing trade system. There are various debates on whether institutions such as the WTO should receive a stronger social mandate or whether trade rules should be linked to the SDGs. I've also seen quite strong criticism towards the SDGs in general. There are debates on whether negotiation processes should be redesigned so that they take into consideration much more the voices and the needs of developing states. But the overarching challenge is to design a trade system that reduces as opposed to exacerbates global disparities. And so, in my question to you is, what would, in your opinion, a concrete reform agenda look like? What should be preserved from the existing institutions or from the existing arrangements? What should be discarded? What should be built from the ground up? Perhaps what your experience with these institutions and with UNCTAD specifically can teach us about where we should go in the future.
Yeah, that's not a small question either.
For sure.
Obviously, one has to recognize when it comes to trade governance that WTO is only one part of that system of international trade governance. And in some respects, it's not the worst part, right? In many respects, bilateral and regional, and particularly regional agreements, bilateral investment treaties, regional agreements are much more, at least from our point of view, problematic from a development point of view. And, if I was to push for one immediate reform, for example, it would be getting rid of the investor-state dispute settlement system, which is incredibly damaging to developing countries and is far more damaging than the WTO's dispute system, that's for sure. So it's difficult to it's always very difficult to kind of disentangle all the various aspects of trade governance when looking for an alternative or reform, a reform agenda. The concern that developing countries have, however, across that system, is that somehow it's reduced the available policy space that they continue to need to address what in many respects are even more strident structural constraints on their development prospects than was true in the 1960s. And you know, it's development is ultimately a policy challenge. It's ultimately a policy challenge. And the more you restrict the possible policy options countries have, the more difficult that challenge becomes. And the feeling is that, you know, WTO, although I would argue it's not been as restrictive as some of those other parts of the system, kind of led the way in terms of reorienting trade governments to controlling trade flows and to some extent private capital to controlling governments, essentially, or to limiting governments and what they could do. So, you know, for me, rolling back measures that are clearly not trade measures but have become part of the WTO intellectual property being an obvious one, various aspects of industrial policy and related regulations being another, I think is imperative if we're going to get a system that actually works in a more inclusive and way that can address 21st century problems. To give you an example, right, I think which is an interesting one in the current circumstances. Obviously, industrial policy was a kind of UNCTAD has always been for industrial policy because development is about diversifying your economy, getting out of dependence on commodities. And remember, I think 100 of the 143 developing, and this is a failure of UNCTAD, 100 of the 145 developing countries are still classified as commodity dependent. That is, over 60% of their foreign exchange earnings come from two or three particular commodities. So, you know, and that's not the basis to benefit. You will never benefit from an international trading system if that is your position in that system. So getting into manufacturing, industrial development was the heart of the UNCTAD agenda. And you need good policies to do that. And markets don't do that for you, at least in our reading of history. And so you need a lot of policies to do that in an effective way, as we've seen in East Asia and again with China more recently. So, you know, but from the way in which the WTO and the World Bank evolved, industrial policies were not a useful part of the toolkit. They were actually a distortion that should be removed from the toolkit because they had distortionary consequences that would, from their point of view, limit development prospects in the South. And that was, you know, famously kind of exemplified by the World Bank's study of the East Asian economies, if you remember, the East Asian miracle, which concluded that whilst they were used in East Asia, they shouldn't be used, but crudely their conclusion, should not be used by other developing countries because they were too difficult and they didn't have the capacities and the history that might allow them to use them effectively. And that was a study funded by the Japanese, actually. The Japanese were not happy with that conclusion. They gave UNCTAD money, not as much as the World Bank, sadly, but they gave us money to do a parallel study where we concluded, of course, that industrial policy was still, even in some respects, even more relevant given the changes in the global economy if developing countries were to develop. Fast forward to now. What has the World Bank suddenly discovered in its latest report? It's suddenly discovered that industrial policy is indeed a necessary part of the policy toolkit, and has come. I mean, I would criticize parts of it, but is genuinely saying, look, countries have to diversify. If you look at history, there's lots of tools that kind of fall under the industrial policy rubric that need to be put back into the development policy toolkit for countries if they're going to develop, right? And you know, we're engaging with them in work I do at SOAS and at Boston University, because I do think that it's a genuine commitment by the World Bank when I listen to the people behind this report. But then your question is, well, can you do this under WTO rules? And the answer is, Well, you can at the moment because rules are irrelevant because the dispute system is no longer working. But if they go back to business as usual, which advanced economies want to do with the WTO, they want to go in an even worse direction. You could not do what the World Bank now says is a necessary part of a healthy policy environment. In fact, if you look at the reform agenda that is being pushed by the Europeans, for example, in the context of the last WTO ministerial, it was very, I mean, and we can criticize Trump and everybody else as much as we like, but the reform agenda of the advanced economies right now is essentially less multilateralism, more liberalization, no development. That's the reform agenda to get the system working again. And we need the opposite. In my opinion, we need the opposite of that. We need more multilateralism, less liberalization, more development. And so the real challenge is how we build up a progressive agenda that speaks to the needs of developing countries there, but also addresses the concerns of parts of the developed world too. I mean, I would argue many communities in the advanced economies have not benefited from the way in which the international trading system has evolved over the last 40 years. Big firms and wealthy asset holders have clearly benefited from that system, but large parts of the north have not benefited from that. So you got to find a way now, I think, of combining those concerns of policy space and diversification, industrialization, with the concerns of I think working communities in the advanced economy. And then you got to throw climate in on top because we can't ignore that. There's a lot going on there, but that's the direction I think we have to steer through, basically.
It seems to me that when we discuss about where to go from now and what kind of reform priorities and proposals would be important, we have to a little bit kind of differentiate between the policy level proper or the regulatory level with respect to specific domains and issue areas. And there's certainly, lots of kind of proposals on the table on that respect. But there's also, and coming back to what we discussed beforehand about forums and forum shopping and forum creation, that we are kind of, again, in this kind of, if you want, institutional interregnum where the United States is basically withdrawing from the institutions at the international level that it, was the most important country to build in the first place. So it seems to me that the United States is not committed to any form of multilateralism anymore. Then you have perhaps the Europeans and a couple of other advanced economies that want to kind of save the current system, particularly the WTO. And then you have China that it seems to me is trying to build up alternative institutions with the BRICS group and with the BRICS Bank, et cetera, et cetera. So they're also, perhaps at the early stages, but nevertheless thinking about de-dollarizing their financial and economic transactions between the BRICS groups of country. So for me, the question is always, isn't this how to deal with these institutional issues? Is it, from your point of view, the best way to go forward that we, kind of stick to the current institutions, be it the WTO, be it the IMF, the World Bank, and try to reform them, shift the balance of power, shift the ideological or policy paradigms in these institutions? Or would you say that, we should think about setting up alternative institutions like with UNCTAD in the 1960s? Is this kind of a more promising way to go forward? Or should we, kind of abstain from reforming the multilateral institutions and shift more towards regional arrangements, for example? So how would you see this kind of institutional priorities and opportunities and limits that we find ourselves confronted with currently?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would go for your latter option, Werner, really. I mean, we need, I mean, if we were in a 1940s moment, I think we would be in a moment where people would consider creating the kind of new institutions that you need to deal with the current problem. I mean, take a classic one, right? The debt issue, which for many developing countries is a priority issue, and without solving that, it's very difficult to see how they will mobilize the resources on the scale they need to address both development and climate problems. That needs new institutions. The World Bank and the IMF, particularly IMF, can't deal with the Paris Club and the whole architecture.
Yeah.
You need that's not going to happen. It's out of the question. We've seen some positives in the Sevilla outcome, but it's not the kinds of institutions that are needed are not going to take place. I think there is a case to stay in pushing for reforms. I mean, small reforms of the current institution. I think developing countries still have to do that. I mean, can we get more out of special drawing rights within the financial system? Can we still push for special and differential treatment within the trading system? I mean, these are genuinely important things to keep doing, I think, and not to abandon. There's no way you can abandon the institutions. You certainly have to. I would argue you have to push back against, and it's not just Trump and the Americans. It would be true if Biden was still in power in the US. That I don't think they are multilaterally minded at this point in their political histories. I really don't think that, despite all the rhetoric and despite Carney going around talking about middling powers, and they don't think multilaterally. And so you're going to have to be very careful as much about those people as you do about Trump. Which leaves, I think, the two options that you talked about, which is the regional option. I think that is increasingly important for I would probably for advanced as well as developing countries, to be honest. But I think the regional story needs to be much more carefully examined and thought about, and proposals made. And then more generally, I think South-South cooperation and integration is where developing countries should invest a lot more of their time, political capital, and ultimately financial capital as well. And that gets you into a very complicated story, which we probably don't have time to, but I'm sure you will discuss on subsequent podcasts, which is the role of China in not only in the global economy, but it's in its relationship with other developing countries. Because the big story about all the things that we've been talking about and the shifting nature of global governance and international institutions hinges on where China goes over the next decade or more. And there's lots of complicated geopolitical and, substantive issues to be raised in that context. But I do think, and I think there's a window of opportunity for developing countries, because China is moving at a pace which I don't think anyone really has fully grasped. And at some point, it will be impossible to talk about it as a developing country. China still sees itself as a developing country, and I would argue it still has some problems that you would associate with other developing countries in a way that you wouldn't with advanced economies. But that window, that will change. At the pace that China's going with its technological advances that it's making, that will change quickly. And so there is a window still, I think, a very important window, where developing countries need to engage more effectively with China in setting up a set of relationships and maybe formalizing those in institutional structures that advance a South-South agenda in a way that never really took off in the NIEO, even though South-South cooperation was a very important part of the NIEO.
Well, I think that has been actually a very good final word, because it leaves us with a very good idea to focus in a subsequent podcast also on discussing more in depth the Chinese economic path and also political and geopolitical ambitions. So at this point, I think we finish for today, and I give back to Anamaria for a few closing remarks. So thanks a lot, Richard, from my point of view, and back to Anamaria.
Yes, thank you both actually for this really insightful debate. Um, yeah, this was the second of 8 episodes in our podcast series from the lessons from the debates on the new international economic order. Please stay tuned and check out the other episodes on our website, viennaglobalforum.org.